Pues buenas tardes y bienvenidos a una sesión más de este ciclo de conferencias que llevamos organizando durante tantas ediciones. Y hoy el ciclo tiene una novedad doble. Primero, que en lugar de 2 ponentes tenemos 3, pero son 2 charlas. La primera charla va a ser a cargo de 2 conferenciantes, y la segunda, Marius Buning y Nana Citron. Bien, es que yo pronuncio muy mal. Y la segunda tenemos a Renate Piper. Esa es la primera novedad. Y la segunda novedad es que la primera charla va a ser en inglés, ¿vale? La segunda en español, pero por deferencia voy a presentar a los 2 primeros conferenciantes en inglés y luego las preguntas pues hacemos, como solemos hacer, una mezcla de idiomas. Al final todos nos entendemos perfectamente bien, hacemos un poco un batiburrillo, así que ahora voy a cambiar de idioma. So, welcome everyone to this session of our seminar. I'm very happy to introduce you Marius Buning and Nana Citron, both of them from the University of Oslo. So Marius is a associate professor of history at the Department of Archaeology, Conservation and History. He finished his PhD as me at the European University Institute. We recently discovered that we were together in there more or less at the same time, so 2013, so more or less at the same time. And since then, he has been fellowship in the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, in the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and in the Humanities Center of the Freie Universität Berlin. He has been researching around the subject of the history of science, specialized in the history of patents and intellectual property. He has published many papers in important journals and book chapters, and also coordinating and writing books. So I cannot really spend many time because it's a very long scientific production, but just to quote some things, in 2021 he has been publishing a book called Knowledge, Patents, Power. So I don't see without my glasses, sorry. And now much better. The Making of a Patent System in the Dutch Republic. And also in 2023, he had published a book by the MIT Press called Ownership of Knowledge Beyond Intellectual Property. And he is the PI of a ERC project called Before Copyright. And the project is about a collection of printing privileges since the 15th century. 15th, 16th century until the 18th, 19th century. And Nana Citron is also part of this international project. She is a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo. In 2022, she finished her MA in History and Theory of Science and Technology from the Technical University of Berlin. She has been working also in the Max Planck Institute with a research project she has been working about the agency of women in early modern printing business. And now she has published a paper with also her colleagues and my friends Andrea Ottoni, Alberto Campillo, called Una base dati per lo studio, and with Marius, per lo studio del sistema de privilegio librario nell'Europa moderna. And currently she's finishing the book. Someone told me, a little bird told me. The book is going to be published by Springer Nature, and the title of the book is, correct me, Spin the Cosmos. I cannot pronounce Vogelen, in the EM commentary tradition of Johannes Tre Sacroboscos de Astrera. that I'm quite sure it's going to be very interesting. So, you know, you have more or less 45 minutes for your presentation, and after that, we can have some time for discussion. Okay?
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for being there. So, thank you, Manuel, Alberto, it's great to be in Seville. We finally get some good weather and some good food. So, you know, it's important stuff for a good seminar that we have now. So what we want to do today is to present you very briefly a bit of the project that you see here, the overall aims of the ERC project. And then I offer one vignette or a small case study on the Dutch Republic. And then I give the floor to Citron, who will give an introduction to her PhD project on the Holy Roman Empire. Everything okay with sound-wise and understanding and all that? Yes? Okay, yes. Good, very good. Okay. So let me just start by saying that the purpose is a bit twofold of coming here. So one, of course, I want to show that this is a really cool project. But second of all, I would also like, you know, to open to work together with some of you in the future. So I hope that by the end of this, we'll come out with like, yeah, that's great. We'll talk later about that. So the Before Copyright project. Fully entitled, as you see here, I have to look sometimes myself, Before Copyright, Printing Privileges and the Politics of Knowledge in Early Modern Europe. Before Copy is one of those abbreviations that if you get an ERC project, you have to call it like that. So I will say Before Copy. It examines the long-term history of printing privileges from an international and also cross-disciplinary perspective. I think that most of you will know what these privileges are. Legal instruments that provided temporary exclusive rights for the production and retailing of books and images, also engravings, for instance, pamphlets, plots, etc. You see some examples here on the slide in front of you. They were first introduced in Europe around 1470, so shortly after the invention of the printing press, and they were abolished around and about the time of the French Revolution. And there were new notions of ownership that emerged alongside new ideas of political representation. Let me see if this works. Yeah, it does. So these are just legal notices. They are mostly in the front or the end of the book. You've seen some of them. These are just random examples, by the way. They occur all throughout Europe, right? So what is important to know is that a privilege had to be applied for. So they were not an automatic right like copyright is nowadays. And they covered only a small percentage of the total amount of books that were being published. We don't know exact numbers. It's part of this project to try to change that a little bit. But I think it would be fair to say that, you know, 5% maybe. It's really a small percentage of the total amount of books. Nonetheless, they strongly affected the distribution and commercial success of a lot of the important intellectual creations produced in this period between 1500 and 1800. So we know that Erasmus, Descartes, Leibniz, and others were all personally involved in obtaining a printing privilege at one point or another. On the other hand, a lot of the cheap and mass-produced print production was also produced under privilege, or cum privilegio. So they had a really important impact on the contemporary readership, but also on how we today perceive the past. And yet I would say that there's hardly any understanding of what printing under privilege really meant outside of a strictly defined legal and economic sphere, so more in terms of the social scope. The traditional view is that the purpose of these printing privileges was mainly or just to diminish the risk of printers. So those printers, it is said, they asked protection when they expected, you know, a success from work still to appear, when a book is already proven to be a bestseller, but also when the production process was very costly. You also hear very often that these privileges had something to do with censorship. That is true to some extent, but the relationship is a bit complicated. So we're not talking about approbations here. That should be clear in this context especially. Nor the right of copy, for instance, which is important in the English context, or printers in the university. We're talking about printing privileges that were issued to individual authors, printers, engravers, and sometimes institutions too. Now, these privileges have been the topic of research before, but this research so far is mainly focused on a national and local perspective. I think there are very good reasons to do so. First of all, it makes your life much easier. But I think that the result is that some of the international connections between different systems of political power and ownership remain underexposed. So what you have to know as well is that a printing privilege had a limited legal validity, and it reached as far as the sovereign powers of the authorities that granted them. So what it meant in practice is that a privilege is issued in France, for instance, it was not valid here in Spain or in England or vice versa. The privilege in Venice was not valid in Rome, even if the Pope would think that his privileges were always valid in all the Christian territories, but some disagreed. It's this legal aspect, I think, that is the primary reason that people tend to focus on the local situation. But what is forgotten, I would say, is that privilege was also sort of a contract between the state and the producer of the text that is in interest of both parties. And what happened, initially at least, is that the privileges were also seen as a form of endorsement by the state, so a type of a quality mark that was used then to manipulate information. In my second part of my talk, I will be brief, but I will give you some short examples of what I mean here by taking the Dutch Republic as a point of departure. But now I want to talk a bit about the project itself. So, and what I call privileged knowledge. The case studies that are a part of this project, they link up to central questions, which are like, for instance, what type of topics were considered worthy of privilege? How did the selection process work? So who was in the commissions, for instance, who judged these applications? Who are the actors, the knowledge brokers? In short, the central question is, how did the legal framework of printing privileges shape the production of knowledge? Now, a few words, very short. I'll be here on the practical side of the ERC project. I thought maybe some would be interested. So, in principle, the team consists of 2 PhDs and 2 postdocs. They work on different geographical areas, and there are a couple of additional projects, like this project with Cambridge and some others. I can say more about it later on. I'm also part of this, of course. I mostly do management of things, but sometimes I write something, mainly on printing privileges in the Dutch Republic. And eventually I will write an overarching studies of these different privilege systems throughout Europe. To that end, I make use also of a database which sort of keeps the project together. So the idea, and you see a sort of impression on the right, although it became very vague on the photo, is to chart distribution of privileges and networks throughout Europe. Alberto is in charge of this at the moment, so if you have questions on the practicalities, you can ask him. And also I want to say it's very important that we have Emilio and also Sarah, who we met yesterday, who are working here actually, who are very important for the project. I don't think it would be possible without them. So thank you very much. Making a database allows us for the first time to make these large-scale comparisons between different countries. So for instance, who are the actors, what type of knowledge was privileged, and how did this interest change over time. At the same time, you have these 3 at the bottom. Can you read a little bit? Yeah, I think so. The 3, what I call...
Sure. The magnifying glass with the plus.
The magnifying glass with the plus.
Next
with
to
the
that,
plus. Just, no, I have that one.
There we go. There we go. That's the big one. Okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So these are what I call like, cross-cutting themes that run through the projects, which are being affected by case studies by the individual members on the project. So they work on these, what I call configurations, epistemology and informative. And to that end, they use, of course, governmental archives, court cases, letters, periodicals, and of course, the privileged objects themselves. So to resume, I said I will promise to keep it short. The central hypothesis of the project is the privilege system is a sort of pan-European media communication system that transforms knowledge not just by putting limits to the type of knowledge that was put into circulation, like censorship, but also by increasing the output of specific materials at the expense of other materials. And instead of buying, as I said, a monodisciplinary or even a local perspective, the project also wants to explore the links between the different jurisdictions throughout Europe. And finally, there we go. What we try to achieve? Well, first of all, to add a new layer to our understanding of what the early history of copyright, and second of all, to open up also new perspectives regarding the question of how knowledge was really produced in early modern Europe, by also putting a focus on new actors and new spaces of interaction. Johnson, for instance. That was my pitch. I promised to keep it short, but I hope it gives you a bit of an idea of what the project is about. And now I thought I'll say a few words about my own research within this framework, so part 2, taking the Dutch Republic as a point of departure. Now, before I get to the thrust of my argument, well, here we go, is it visible somehow? I thought it would be useful to situate the topic a bit in time and space. So I know we have some experts on Dutch history in the room, but nonetheless, this is 17 provinces at some point, the Dutch Republic, northwestern corner of Europe, and it became de facto independent in 1583, so after the abjuration of Philip II. It was at that point that the Dutch political leadership also felt it was needed to take official printing policies into their own hands. This Dutch system of printing privileges emerged at the height of the 80 Years' War, and so in the mid-1580s. It followed enlarged pattern, as we know it from other European countries, mainly from the southern Netherlands, which meant that the highest authorities of a particular jurisdiction, they gave limited rights, mostly 6 to 15 years, for the exclusive production of text or images to authors, translators, but mainly printers. So they could not copy that work without permission. Illegal reproductions, they were confiscated, and the perpetrator would have to pay an additional fine. So we have also an overview here on the right, that for you too, yeah, on the right. What you have to know is that privileges in the Republic were mainly issued by the States General and not so much by the towns. These are the 3 layers of government that we have, mainly in the Dutch Republic. I won't delve deep into this, but I think when I say States General, this is the highest authority that we have in the Dutch Republic, and it's actually assembly where the 7 provinces met to make decisions together in a republican state. So they were represented with 1 vote. So in short, a privilege issued by the States General, it was valid in all of the 7 provinces, but it was not valid in France, right? Also, let me remind you that it was not obligatory to get a privilege. So according to estimates, only 1% actually in the Dutch Republic was granted exclusive rights. It's a very small percentage of the total production. I think the main question then is to understand why certain books get a privilege and others did not, and that's what I will talk about in this. So the classical argument here is that the focus is very much on the printers. So Paul Hofsteiser, he argued in the 1990s, and I quote here, "The issue of a privilege is mainly about the commercial interest of publishers and booksellers," end quote. And it became really the standard vision of that very strange Dutch Republic. Well,
oh, just click again.
That's right, that's right. Hello. So his idea here, as you see, is that the process of applying for a privilege was only worthwhile when the printers would expect a resounding successful word still to appear, when the work already was proven to be a bestseller, or when printers wanted to invest their investments, expensive paper, engravings, etc. Now, this is of course not incorrect, but I would like to argue that it is incomplete. And I think these are some of the other aspects that we should take into consideration.
Yeah, put it here.
All right, there we go. So here you see a little overview. I mean, one thing, of course, doesn't exclude the other, but I think it makes things a bit more, you get a better grip of what we're talking about here. So one of the things is standardization. School books, books about coinage, for instance, a lot of legal literature was produced under privilege. Maps, obviously, certain newspapers, quality control, and also there was a lot about promotion, so the certain type of morals that the authorities wanted to diffuse among the population. I will speak more about that. So actually, all of our projects within, you will see that Nana has a slightly different focus than I do. We all emphasize different aspects in this circle, if you want. I don't see that as a problem. yes. I could say a bit more about standardization, but I decided to focus more on promotion, taking the Dutch as a starting point. So the point I will try to make is twofold. One, that privilege should be seen as more as just something related to commercial interest. And B, that this political understanding of printing privileges also can help us to understand why, when, and how specific publications were put on the market. Now the first, let's try again. Here, example I wanted to bring up, and this is what I want to note, is that privileges were not just granted for expensive print jobs, so it was not just about images or paper, but also for cheap pamphlets, for instance. This is one example, is the repentance of Jean Haren, a Walloon Reformed minister from Bruges who had temporarily converted to Catholicism before returning to the Reformed Mother Church, right? In 1610, the Dutch States General then issued a 6-year privilege to Louis Elsevier to bring this repentance into circulation, both in French and translated into Dutch. I think here it's clear that it's not about protecting investments. I mean, it's a small booklet without any images, and it cannot have been expensive to produce, even if one had to pay a translator, for instance. So rather, I think that the states wanted to make sure that the proper edition of this pamphlet was put into circulation, to edify the public, so to say. Something similar is the case in this example. 1608, you see Cochelet published this pamphlet, wonderful title, The Affair of Calvin, which was marketed in Antwerp under the privilege of the Catholic Archduke Albert and Isabel. Less than a year later, the Dutch States General, so Protestant state, granted the Dordrecht-based printer a 5-year privilege to diffuse the written reply by Polyander. And that's what you see on the right. So there are many of these examples which I think indicate that we should consider these privileges also as not part of a local context, but as part of an ongoing ideological warfare. On the other hand, it was not just about confrontation, but it was about cooperation as well. So we know that because of this limited validity of the printing privilege, there were some authors or printers who moved from one jurisdiction to the next to collect as many privileges as possible. And sometimes they did not hesitate also. I have an example, I think, here, to display these privileges right next to each other. This one, the humanist Adriaan van Schrik, who obtained the privilege both from Isabel and Albert VII, as well as from the State General of the United Province of Privilege, to print his works on the origins of the people in Europe, Dutch, French, and Latin. So a delicate detail in this instance is that Van Schrik was based in the southern Netherlands, in Ypres. And he chose to make use of a well-known Jesuit printer, which was François Bellet. So perhaps the Dutch authorities in this case, they turned a blind eye, if you want, because Van Schrik argued in his treatise that Dutch was the mother tongue of all languages, was already spoken in paradise. Yeah, who knows? But however, the fact that the Dutch authorities did privilege books that were produced outside of their jurisdiction, I think also indicates that they were not just a measure to protect local printers against copying, but they also functioned as a hallmark to indicate that they have given their blessing to this project, right? And I think that this understanding of printing privileges is not unique to the Dutch Republic. So just as the Dutch, they privileged books produced outside of their jurisdiction, other authorities also privileged books produced in the Netherlands of the Dutch Republic. And one example concerns the privilege for a 1594 edition of Cyclometria Elementa, written by Scaliger. So it was issued at time, for example, here, when the Dutch and the French still worked together against the Spanish habsburgs. When Scaliger came over to Leiden, so Scaliger, like the humanist scholar, came over to the University of Leiden. He came from France in 1993. One of his first publications was this rather curious book about the squaring of a circle. It was printed by Franciscus Ravelenius the Elder, who was responsible for the Plantin business in Leiden. Plantin, very famous printer, I think you may have heard of in, I don't know. Yeah, it had this privilege. I take out some aspects here. So I'm sorry, there's a lot of text. I normally don't do that. but just look at the highlighted pieces here. Issued by the King of France, Henry IV, to forbid anybody to produce this publication, but it was granted for Latin work, printed in the Dutch Republic, whereas the privilege only had validity in France, right? So again, I think this shows that it did not necessarily serve to protect local printers against piracy, and even if the legal scope was limited to a particular jurisdiction. Now, having this context in mind, this background, I think it can help us to understand also the timing or the periods of specific publications. And I want to exemplify this by one last example, before we move on to the next talk, namely this one. There, yeah. Rather known book like Grotius, De Mare Liberum, which appeared in a Dutch translation in 1614. Now, this book on the freedom of the seas, it's essentially propaganda, that argues for equal rights of navigation and trade by the authorities in the East Indies. It was first published on the request of the Dutch East Indies companies, and I think it, by the way, it has been characterized as justifying colonialism, colonial trade, and colonial domination. The text was ready for print, the Latin text I should say, in 1608, but the publication was deferred at the request of the authorities to the end of April 1609 in order to avoid jeopardizing the ongoing negotiations on the 12-year truce between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Dutch. So only when that truce was concluded on the 9th of April 1609, the Dutch authorities allowed these treaties to appear, but without a privilege and without any reference to the author. Everybody knew it was Grotius, but it was not on the title page, right? During the peace conferences between the Dutch and the Spanish, it was also agreed that the truce would take effect in the East Indies 1 year after the date of its ratification in Europe. But then it soon turned out to be impossible to sustain this truce in the East Indies, and by 1613 at the latest, it had definitely broken down in the regions covered by the Dutch and the East Indies Charter. I don't think it's a coincidence that at this point in time you get this privileged translation of Grotius' text into Dutch. For those who speak Dutch. Oh yeah, you do? Yeah. There you go. All right. Oh, you have Dutch. So. Oh, that's mooi. Hier, kan het lezen van zo'n vragen? Bevordering des Vaderlands. Bevordering des Vaderlands, in Spanish translation. So, to the progress of the motherland, or fatherland in this case. Yeah, this book was produced in the 1640s. I think, the Dutch authorities, they used it as part of their strategy to defend their overseas politics to a home public. So the Leiden printer Jan Huibrechtson explained in the preface, and I quote, that everybody should read this. The booklet should be read by everyone as proof of the right issued by us, but begrudged by some mighty states, so that what the Latinists know but do not practice would be understood by those who deal with these issues on a daily basis. End quote. When the printer petitioned for a privilege on the 15th of August 1614, the States Generals, or the highest authorities, they wanted to consult Grotius first to see if he was pleased with the result. And 3 days later, the printer indeed obtained this exclusive right for the sale and production of the booklets, and also the state's authorities, they took off 1 copy for their own use, so they know what they were doing. So as you see, this privilege was not requested in advance, but after the translation has been made, which makes no sense if you're trying to protect economic investments. The fact also that the states were so invested with the quality of the translation, I think, shows that the printing privilege denoted that they privileged rather the content of the book, and that also it's matched their semi-official position. Now, my conclusions. Privileges in the Dutch Republic, they're mostly understood as a straightforward means used by printers to secure their economic position on the market and to secure steady sellers in their portfolio. I want to argue, however, that they were equally part of what I call soft power machinery that was used by the Dutch authorities to establish the Republic as an important state in its own right. So my goal is to steer the attention away a bit from privileges as just being an economic measure or something that has to do with the repression of knowledge, and also to show how the Dutch authorities use these privileges to promote specific knowledge at least the type of knowledge they thought was useful. And one important conclusion that can be drawn from all this is that the central authorities, so the States General and the Republic, were not passive observers when it came to the development of the printing industry, which is something you still hear in traditional Dutch historiography. So in some aspects, the federal authorities were not able to assert themselves. In other areas, such as privilege conferment, I think their authority was clearly present, and the state intervened, and thereby also shaped the production of knowledge. So that is my contribution. And I will give the word now to Nana, who will say something about her printing, her project on printing privilege in the Holy Roman Empire. Do something?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, also from my side. So it's great to be here. So Marius gave the introduction about the project, and I, as he said, am responsible for the Holy Roman Empire part. And I'm looking at how authorities treated privileges in the Holy Roman Empire. But my main task is my PhD project, which is women's agency and the early modern printing trade. So I use privileges in a rather different way than Marius does. So I plan to tell you a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire and how privileges were treated there, and then about my project, including an example case. So first of all, I think the next slide, you have to turn your head a bit. So it unfortunately was twisted due to the, bringing it on this computer. So my first point is I want to tell you about the archival situation in the Holy Roman Empire, which is a complicated region, especially when you have to turn your head. So you can see that during the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire included lots of regions, for example, Poland, what is today's Germany, also parts of northern Italy, even parts of the Low Countries and France, but this changed over the centuries. So we have different jurisdictions, as you can already see here, so lots of lines, borders, and we also have lots of movements depending on political developments. And later on, due to the Habsburg Empire, for example, the Holy Roman Empire somehow also connects with Spain or Denmark. So there are some complex situations when it comes to privileges or political situations in general. So this area, you can see here, had an overarching privilege system, which was directed from Vienna in Austria. And so far we have quite a nice research base about this, because everything was directed from Vienna, and from the 17th century onwards, privileges there were copied and stored. So far there are 2 books that give a good overview about what happened. And so, for example, in 2008 was a book published, which you know quite well, it's from Hans-Joachim Koppitz. He went to Vienna to the archive, cited all the privileges that were stored there, and published a 700-page volume that lists all the privileges. So though we had quite a good overview of the research, you have to be careful with these kind of sources. So they are always a good starting point to work with, but such works can never be complete. So when you try to investigate privileges, whether Low Countries or Germany, Holy Roman Empire, you have to be careful what you have, what you see. So as I said, they just stored privileges from the 17th century onwards. And prior to that, privileges were already existing, were already been granted, but no copies of them were stored. So as Marius already said, privileges could also be used for promotion. They could be good advertisement, so people were eventually likely to buy a book when it said it had a privilege. So sometimes printers also used this statement of privileges for their books to advertise it, though they did not have a privilege. So when you find privileges in books, you always have to be careful whether this existed or not in reality. And for our research base, it's also the case that we sometimes read about privileges in another source, but we don't have a proof of it, neither in the book nor in the archive. So another relevant point here is that in the Holy Roman Empire, not just the emperor, who was located in Vienna, was likely to grant privileges or allowed to grant them, but also we have smaller cities who were allowed to give privileges. I will talk about that later. So when you go to archives and try to find privileges, they are sometimes not listed. You sometimes find them hidden in big chunks of paper, so it's not the easiest way to find out about them. Yeah, so the historical part, wait, no. Yeah, so as I said, other authorities were also allowed to grant privileges, and I want to talk a little bit about this situation, and then about my specific project. So the rights to grant privileges were in the Holy Roman Empire called Bücherregal, regalian rights or royal rights for books. So these included the authorization to grant privileges, as you can see here, for authors, printers, also for engravers in some situations. The oversight of printing, how many printing privileges were allowed in shops, for example. Then the enforcement of censorship, so censorship laws controlled content, and also regulation of booksellers and printers. So at some point they regulated the shops or limited the cities that were allowed to have printers. And the Holy Roman Empire was the main authority holding these rights. But besides him, we have also electors, princes, counts, or imperial cities that gave privileges. And as Marius already said, a privilege was always valid for the region where the authority, from which authority it was granted. So you could, for example, get a privilege just from the elector of Saxony, just for the region of Saxony, but then princes were likely to also go for the Holy Roman Empire to secure the privilege on both levels. And I think Marius said a little bit about this. You submitted a petition to an emperor and you had to pay a fee that was graduated according to the importance of your work and also the duration of protection. So we had, usually it was between 3 to 10 years, sometimes for a lifetime. And we also, in the Holy Roman Empire, have a distinction between special privileges that were given for specific works or general privileges. So printers or publishers could also secure the monopoly on the whole printing output of their shop. But this, for example, was prohibited from the 17th century onward in some regions because of the monopoly. And that was also the reason why it was prohibited. So, yeah. And one last point about privileges, which will lead me to my project. So the motivations for granting or petitioning privileges were very different for rulers or printers. So for printers, I mean printers and publishers, just to make sure you know what I'm talking about. So rulers' motivations, as you can see here, were mainly public benefit, reprinting protection, or censorship control, whereas printers were interested in fair competition, advertising reputation, and economic security. So especially the point about fair competition was really important for printers. They even enforced local regulations within their own trade. These are called printers' ordinances, where they stated that they tried to protect the peace and cooperation within the trade, so they enforced local regulations about these privileges. And especially this point about reason for petitioning of privileges leads to the topic of my own project, which is interconnected with the ERC project and located in it. So as I said, I also use privileges for my work, but with a different approach. I use them to understand women, but especially their agency in the early modern printing trade. So I want to talk first about the situation of women in the early modern period in Western Europe. So this differs according to region. I know I heard a little bit from Natalia, but the framework I think was mainly the same everywhere. So the obstacles women had to face were similar due to like systems of power, like patriarchy. And the common ones were social expectations that were applied to women. So according to the life stages, for the Holy Roman Empire, it was common that certain obstacles and expectations were tied to the stage of daughter, wife, or widow. Then the class and economic status was also a relevant point, so they had a strong dependence on male relatives. And I would love to hear about Spain in this regard, because I know it's a little bit different. And this was also tied to economic opportunities, and also local customs and regulations, which included the church. So agency, on this hand, could change the situation for women. So agency as such is used to describe options that marginalized groups, but for my case especially women, can gain and use to express a certain kind of freedom within the dominant power structures of society. And that's what I'm basically investigating with the help of privileges. So I try to define agency in the specific case I investigate. And in short, it can be said agency describes how women use options to enable their freedom. So it can be given a more defined definition when it comes to women in the printing trade in early modern Western Germany, I would say. So I started to investigate how agency can be facilitated, but also what influences agency or restricts it. And I divided this by rigid circumstances, changeable factors, and contextual limitations. So rigid factors are factors that are at that time not possible to be changed, which is sex, sexuality, and class. And then we have changeable factors for early modern women, which were knowledge, skills, and money, which could be altered or gained, trained, or acquired. And then we have contextual limitations. That is something that is changeable, but more on a systematic level. So nothing a woman could individually or regularly easily influence, like obligations, religion, and law. So how is this then interconnected with privileges? So privileges are a relevant factor for women in the book trade to gain agency. I compiled, as I said, a list of factors that foster or facilitate agency, which is what you can see here. So let's start up here, which is social, family, and business networks. So such networks could, of course, foster agency due to good connections or supportive family members. And what I've also observed is that when there was one woman that is to be found which had a certain form of agency, there can be found more women within her family or within her business network. And especially when such networks consisted of people with good reputations, such networks can really facilitate agency a lot. The next one is access to money. So money is always freedom up until today and gives options. And women had access to money in the Holy Roman Empire's printing trade, either as the economic manager of the family shop or as the business owner. Skills, of course, facilitates agency, so especially reading, writing, calculating, relevant craft skills. So sometimes women grew up in print shops and learned a significant skill set. Then we have publishing under male pseudonyms, which is Hears Of or Widows Of, which interests me especially in regards to Spain, because I'm from Natalia. That was not common in Spain, but that was very common in the Holy Roman Empire. So women, in most cases, had to continue their printing business and thus economic independence with the reputation of their husband, who was dead at that point, or sometimes as authors, they had to spread their ideas under the protective names of a male. So then we come to privilegia, so the privileges. I will talk about this soon. Also, another option was going to court. So due to going to court, women were able to achieve justice that was otherwise denied to them. Another point is widowhood. So women could gain more freedom by being a widow because they had a different social status and automatically had more freedom. And also women as widows were allowed to become a print master, which they weren't allowed to do prior to that. And knowledge, of course, is always something that facilitates agency, because then you know how to navigate social expectations, authorities, and law. So all of these factors are tied to privilege in a wider sense, and privileges also are a factor in itself. but why did privileges facilitate agency? So privileges could be equivalent to money. Women could use them to gain economic independency after the husband died, because women were then inheriting such privileges. They could reapply to them, and they were usually given to them. And in this way, they could secure their position in the market with privileges. And also, in some cases, they could justify the right to print. So we have cases of women who were tried to kick out by the town council, and then they said, well, see, by the means of the highest authority, I'm allowed to be a printer because I have such a privilege. Yeah, so I'm investigating basically why they can be a good source for gender history. And also, they show how women got in contact with the highest authorities and were able to navigate such obstacles. So I brought some brief case of a woman from Frankfurt to show, wait, that comes later, how that could have looked. So Frankfurt am Main, as you eventually know, has a long tradition in the printing trade. So in the 12th century, already prior to printing with printing presses, Frankfurt established a regular fair that is still existing today as the Frankfurt Book Fair that takes part annually. And by the 15th century, Frankfurt was already a central hub for the book trade. And it was home of several popular and successful printers' families. One of them was the Egenolf family. And my focus is, for example, on Margareta Egenolf, who was the wife of Christian Egenolf the Elder, the head of this printers dynasty. And Margareta Egenolf ticks almost all the boxes I just presented that facilitate agency. So Margareta had a well-established business and social network. She had access to money and made sure to maintain this. She also managed the shop when her man died, but she was very likely to do it beforehand also. And even when she, as a widow, and when she was old, left the business management to her children, she made sure to leave the hands on the assets of the family and still manage that until she died. So she also published all the books under the name of her deceased husband, and yeah, to make sure that they were sold quite well, because he was a very prestigious printer in Frankfurt. And she immediately applied for the privileges of her husband when he died. So we do not find her in front of the court, which is very unlikely for women at that time. So yeah, she was somehow able to maintain a successful business and take on some other strategies. She also founded a printing co-op and contributed to the first printers' ordinance of Frankfurt. So she somehow made sure to protect and empower other women as well, not just take care of herself. So she stayed also in the business for a certain amount of time due to the privileges she had. And especially the Printers' Ordinance is an interesting point, because she not just committed to her own success, but her daughters, for example, stayed with her in the business. And though both daughters married men from other trades, not printers, they were able to continue printing with her because their mother secured their rights due to the Printers' Ordinance. So in the first Printers' Ordinance, women were not named at all. They were not denied anything, but they were not specifically allowed stuff, because Margareta somehow has proven that she was able to maintain such a successful business. And she just made sure that her daughters were able to continue these businesses. So in later times, women in later Printers' Ordinances of Frankfurt, women were more likely to be limited in their actions. But at that time, Margareta made sure they still had all the freedom and helped her daughters continue this, the success of the printing business. So she serves as a good example, especially when you go more in detail with her, why or how the potential for agency could affect change, not just for her individually, but also for other women. Yeah, so she somehow combined her own agency with the legacy of her husband, and then she became a very influential and interesting figure in the printing trade. So, but I will write more in detail about her in my thesis. And Agate was so kind to extract some data for me from the database. which I also want to show because due to our database we can see a broader framework of women and what they did or how they applied for privileges. Because Margareta, of course, was not the only one. There were several women all over Europe applying for privileges with some interesting stories behind, because due to book printing, you can't just trace women all along. But due to the privileges we have, we can find more women active in the trade than we find by books. And here we have female versus male granting institutions. So you can see down here in the corner is Vienna, where most of the privileges were granted in the Holy Roman Empire, or Paris is here, here's Madrid. And these on the left are women who, for example, lived over here and applied to Vienna. And the same goes for men. So men, of course, we have a way more packed map, but with the data we currently have, we can extract these women. We can also employ social networks. So we have here females versus males and females and the genres they applied for. And you can also see that women and men were connected with their privileges at this point here. Wow. So yeah, thanks a lot for your attention.